Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Great to see you here this evening, and great to welcome our guest, Andrew Sullivan, who I will talk about in a second. Just a couple of housekeeping things. This session is being live streamed. It is on the record, even though you're in Chatham House. It's not under the rule. And the title of today's discussion, which I hope you'll get involved in, is how to regulate the internet without breaking it. And this is a conversation with Andrew Sullivan, who I'm really, really pleased to welcome here to Chatham House again. Andrew is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Internet Society, a position he's held since September last year. But to those of you in the audience who are part of what we call the internet community, you will have been familiar with Andrew's work. He has worked on infrastructure and technical standards since 2001. In 2012, he joined Dyn, now Oracle Dyn, which is a major infrastructure DNS provider. And as a result of that involvement in Dyn, he was elected by his peers as chair of the Internet Architecture Board, which oversees the development of technical standards through the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IATF, and is also very closely linked with the Internet Society. So I guess it is a sort of a natural transition that you've made into the Internet Society. But Andrew is a man of parts, as we would say. He's not just not only a technical person.
Highly unjust.
End of career. Right. He's a programmer, but also started life as a philosopher and a musician. So for anybody who thinks that the arts and the sciences are two things divided by a wall, walls are very much in vogue at the moment. It's not true, is it, Andrew? So, when you were sitting in 2001 developing the .info bid, did you imagine that in nearly 20 years the internet would look as it does? That we would even be talking about how to regulate this thing? Do you think it's possible to regulate the internet?
Those are two really interesting questions. So the answer to the first one is, if I had known what the internet was going to look like, I would have invested differently. But I think that the thing that's quite interesting about it is that we keep talking about the internet as though it's a monolith, right? We talk about this as though, let's go and regulate the internet, as though it's the table. And the problem with the internet is that it's a network of networks, and so in fact regulating it is almost a grammatical error, right? You make this kind of mistake where you think, oh, there's this thing there, and because it has the grammatical form of talking about the table or the car, that it's a single thing. And I think one of the things we need to think about when we talk about this kind of regulation is that the internet, the term the internet, is much more like the term the traffic. If you split the table in half, you don't have a table anymore. What you have are two table parts. If you split traffic in half, what you have are traffic. You don't have two traffics, you got traffic. And the same thing is true of the internet, that if you split it into different parts, as long as you continue to have interconnection among them, what you really still have is the internet. And these different pieces need different kinds of responses.
But when, say, politicians or legislators are thinking about regulating the internet now, we both know that while that might be, your characterization might be technically the correct one, of course it is, actually what is in the legislator's mind is we've got to stop this this Facebook thing, this Google thing, this Amazon thing, that actually it has become, it may well be an interconnected network of private networks, but some of those networks are rather large and could, once you get to over 2 billion users, you could pretty much strike out on your own.
Well, yes. In one sense you can, and in another sense you can't. So it sort of depends on which 2 billion you're talking about. If you're talking about the domestic population of China, then you actually have the ability to do that, right? And we see, in fact, China do that. They've drawn a wall, the so-called Great Firewall. They have certain kinds of interconnections with the rest of the world, and you can think of that as a very tightly controlled online service with partial access to the internet much of the time. This is a little bit of a cartoon version of it, but it's still worth thinking that the so-called Chinese internet isn't really like the internet very much at all. There's another kind of 2 billion user case, which of course is some of the social media platforms, which have very large number of users. What's different about that is that they're actually dependent on the underlying infrastructure. So you can't divorce a social media system from the internet and say, oh well, they could strike out on their own, because they're completely dependent on this underlying network that actually delivers all of the traffic. And so to pick on one of them, but this is not to pick on anybody. Facebook, for instance, full disclosure, is one of our partners in developing networks in Africa. And the reason they want to do that is because they know they're dependent on this underlying infrastructure. So at one and the same time, yes, it's true, they're building a kind of system which is encompassing of users. At the same time, they're building a system that is encompassing of users that delivers this underlying network. And in delivering that underlying network, it also builds infrastructure that can be used for other purposes. And these are different approaches to how you want to build this kind of network. But there's something else in what you're saying that I think is quite interesting. So we're talking right now about how you would define the internet. So we had 3 terms in this description of today that I think are interesting. We had regulate, we had break, and we had the internet. So we already talked a little bit about what the internet is, although I don't know if we're all the way there yet. We still have problems with what it would mean to regulate, and we still have problems with what it means to break it. And so I think if we try to solve all 3 parts of that equation at the same time, maybe we'll get somewhere.
Okay, so which would you like to do first? Shall we do regulating? Shall we think about, how successful, not just regulation of the internet, but perhaps regulation of technologies, emerging technologies, society-changing technologies, which I think we can agree this is. If you look back, what's your reflection when you think about sort of early attempts to, say, regulate, I don't know, automobiles or even buildings or stuff like that? Were they successful, and how did they shape the development of those industries? Can we learn from these examples, do you think?
So I think we can. So it's good to mention buildings, because here we are in a relatively old building, right? And it's here with all of its listing and all of this tradition and so on, and yet we have lights. So I'm pretty sure when this was built, those were not there because we hadn't figured out how to harness electricity yet, and yet somehow we managed to put it in. Why did we do that? Well, if you think about the history of building regulation and building codes and electrical regulation and so on, one of the really interesting things about them is that they're really a protection scheme. And they're a protection scheme for insurance companies. So one of the first things to recognize about this is that money was at stake, real money, right? Because the early electrical systems or the early building systems or so on, they tended to burn down. And the reason they tended to burn down was because amateurs put them together, and or people who had an interest in getting the profit as fast as possible and leaving, they would do that, and so you'd end up with these systems that tended to catch on fire. Insurance companies ended up having to pay out in those cases, and they didn't like paying out because they thought, well, I wasn't responsible for that shoddy installation, and so why should I have to pay for this thing? They made the bet, but they didn't understand what they were betting on. And so what they wanted were common rules about what the buildings were going to be like. Why were they going to be built that way? What were the protections between this building and the building next door? I live in a house in Toronto that was built actually outside of the city limits at the time it was built, so there's no firewall between me and my neighbors. I'm in a row house. And this, of course, was done, they built outside of the city limits precisely so that they didn't have to put in the firewall, because the firewall was expensive. And the firewall was there to protect the insurance companies who wouldn't insure anything outside of the city limits because there was no firewall there. So this is an ongoing sort of social debate that we have. You mentioned automobiles. There's another example of that. It's really interesting to me In 1957, in North America, you could buy a Cadillac that had a power roof, it had a power trunk, it had power door locks, power seats, it had a remote trunk release, whatever that meant before RF things. It had some magic automatic leveling system that was, I mean, this is 1957. You couldn't buy this car with seatbelts in it if you wanted to. It was not a factory installable thing. It wasn't even a dealer installed option because there were no anchors for seatbelts in that car. You had to have those welded in special. Now, we got regulation in the automotive industry, right? It changed things quite dramatically. And there's no question whatsoever that cars today are vastly safer than that 1957 Cadillac. They're also vastly more fuel efficient, and they're vastly less polluting. So there are many ways in which automobiles got better. It's also true, however, that the encroaching regulatory regime caused General Motors to reorganize itself in an effort to try to make sure that it wasn't subject to antitrust efforts. And General Motors spent most of the 1960s and 70s and part of the 1980s attempting to foil the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation. And not, to my mind, not incidentally, General Motors went bankrupt in 2008. So in 1957, in the year that I was talking about, General Motors made approximately 50% of all automotive production in the entire world. And they went bankrupt in 2008. Now, that is an achievement. And no, it is. And I think that what this is instructive, the reason this is instructive to me is not to bash on General Motors, but rather to point out that this kind of change in the industry is a dynamic change. It doesn't merely, a regulator doesn't come in and sort of say, okay, well, here's everybody, stay in your places, and now I'm just going to put some rules in place. Everybody's going to move. Everybody's going to move in that market. The regulator is a mover. The actors in the market are a mover. And of course, the customers are a mover. And so this is a dynamic situation, which means that the regulation affects the market, which then affects how the regulations work. And I think this is an ongoing problem.
Very interesting to reflect on the role of insurance as a driver of standards. This is something that we continually sort of puzzle about here, and also a major difference, of course, because a lot of the standard, the brakes so to encourage innovation, companies that produces software or were active online were given a sort of break from liability if they conformed certain rules. And those breaks from liability are sort of under pressure, but they still exist, and they probably shaped a lot of the environment. They've stimulated a lot of growth, no doubt. But it's also interesting to reflect that the role of the insurer as a sort of standards driver is at the moment rather absent from our environment. And that leaves a sort of this binary choice of no regulation or self-regulation dressed up, and a bit like the kind of gamerish building company that built your houses. Okay, outside the city limits then. We see that gamerish attitude in a lot of the companies in response to regulation. It's like, it says this, well, we'll comply with the letter, but not the spirit. And so do you think actually that lifting those sort of brakes, those incentives to which were meant to stimulate innovation, and actually forcing these companies into a position where they are liable for their products will actually improve standards and will be a way of regulating without breaking?
It's hard to know, of course, exactly what it does. I mean, if my crystal ball were better, I'd probably be much richer, and I would have perfect vision of this. But what I do think is today we're hearing a number of companies calling for direct regulation of them, and that strikes me as very similar to the sorts of things that we heard from a number of companies in other various kinds of environments, where the idea is, I'm the leader of this thing, and so what I should do is shape the regulatory regime such that it looks like the market that we have now. But another way that people could engage with this is to say, well, actually, we think that this liability protection is too great, And we think that the market should shift in this way. And here's the way in which we think liability should work in this environment. And here's what we think you should be insured against. One of the things that I find interesting is that there does appear to be I wouldn't call it burgeoning, but maybe it's a little past nascent market in cyber insurance, right? With identity theft and with various kinds of denial of service attacks, for instance, on your business and so on. There is an increasing number of those things that involve insurance. It seems to me that the first really big payout under one of those things is going to alter this market quite a bit, because we think of the very large players in the internet, the sort of giants that people think of. That's the first thing that comes to mind when people talk about regulation of the internet. But the first victim is unlikely to be one of those. The first victim is likely to be somewhere further down, but possibly quite easily wiped out. So I used to, when I worked at Dine, for instance, we had a number of clients that were quite large, but maybe not the biggest clients that we had. And those were real businesses, businesses of a few $100 million a year. Well, if you wipe out a business of a few $100 million a year, there's real losses there. And some of them were publicly traded. And so then you've got people whose life savings have been wiped out. And in the United States, of course, all of those people are liable to sue, well, any passing stranger. I have part of my life in the United States. I feel comfortable saying that sort of thing. The thing is that those insurance companies are going to have to pay out. And insurance companies are very large financial institutions, and they do have a lot of power, and they will insist that things be modified in order to address that. So the challenge, in my opinion, for industry is, in fact, to get ahead of that game, rather than saying, oh, well, we need to regulate this thing now. We need to figure out what that market ought to look like, because that would actually address many of these issues without people sort of trying to decide what content should be online.
That point about, not the biggest companies, because the biggest companies seem to be, well organized. Right. But when you think about, how to regulate the internet without breaking it, let's have a think about, some regulation that we're familiar with that, and let's hear your reflections on it. Like we were all obsessing last year with general data protection regulation, and in fact that carried a long-arm jurisdiction over to many companies on the other side of the Atlantic. Do you feel that that's actually, when you were talking about, the big companies seem to be fine, they do seem to be fine with GDPR, do you think? And it seems to be the companies in the middle. I don't know. Do you feel that it's been successful in empowering the user and getting everybody's control of their data back?
Well, I think the jury's still out. I mean, I think on that particular issue, it's going to be a long time before we know what the precise effects of this are. What we do know is that this has had extraterritorial effects that are sometimes quite unanticipated, right? So there are American newspapers that you cannot look at from this country right now because they don't think the liability is worth it. And by the way, it's not true, of course, that you can't look at it from this country right now. What it means is you can't look at it from this IP location right now, and your internet protocol location is not, in fact, a geographic location at all because it was designed that way. And so it's entirely possible to get around those restrictions, and then it's anybody's question as to whether somebody has actually achieved the necessary protections. So that's one of the dimensions. But there's another thing about this that I think is really quite important, and that is, it's not hard for a multi-billion-dollar corporation to comply with these regulations. The fines are admittedly quite severe, and I think that they would be significant even for a company that was very, very large. And I think that's actually an indication of something that the GDPR got right. It was intended to change the market dynamics of this, and so that's a thread that is interesting and a valuable piece of insight. Where there is a problem, though, is if you think of the very bottom of a market. So I don't know how many of you have ever been in a startup. I did a bunch of startups in my past. And you normally have about 6 weeks of money. So 6 weeks from now, you're going to run out of cash. And what that means, of course, is that if somebody comes along and said, "You're not doing the GDPR right, I'm gonna issue a fine for, you know, like many hundreds of thousands of pounds or euros or whatever," your response is, "Okay, like I'm going home, like I'm, you know, my garage. Here you go." You know, there's not much to do. Yeah. And if you are, you know, a $200 billion corporation, you say, "Talk to my phalanx of lawyers here, please," and you're all set. But if you are one of the organizations that was trying to move from 3 people in a garage to world-killing, you know, ginormous company, you are somewhere along this continuum. And this continuum is the place that is actually most dangerous, because it's the place where you could be wiped out tomorrow, and yet you've got real investors and you've got real money at stake and you've got, you know, a staff of maybe 100 people. And that's the kind of organization that could be trivially wiped out by this style of regulation. And I think that that's an interesting problem, because what that means is that anybody who wants to move from tiny little startup to world-killing organization actually needs to move out of Europe in the meantime and get rid of all of their European customers, or, you know, regulated environment customers if the same kind of style of regulation happens somewhere else, for fear of the consequences. Or, you know, maybe they take the risk, or they buy some insurance against it or something like that. But there's a limited range of things that you can do in that case, because you don't have the resources while you're making that switch actually to do the investment necessary to make sure that you're protected. And while you're making that switch, of course, every dime that you invest in one of these kind of compliance things is a dime you're not investing in building features for your users who are going to come along. That's a real regulatory problem.
So you decide to move out of Europe, and then you end up getting hit by the Trump executive order, which also reaches across the Atlantic in the other direction and prevents you from trading essentially with China or anybody on the list of prescribed companies. Do you think that, you know, and we've seen the collateral damage of that?
Absolutely.
So on Google, poor Google with the Android, but poor ARM here in the United Kingdom providing chips. Do you think that was the intended consequence of the executive order?
I am not going to speculate on the intentions of the consequences of the United States administration right now. What I will say is I'm prepared to say that we have a lot of this kind of collateral damage in all these directions. And it's true, like, you know, poor Google with Android, poor Huawei maybe with Android, poor ARM here, but also poor users in Africa, right, who've just been stuck with phones that they can't upgrade essentially forever. And this is, you know, among a population who really had to dig to get that kind of accessibility. And that's another consequence. So we have just, in fact, made a whole swath of the world more vulnerable to security problems. Remember those security problems that were causing the denial of service that at my previous employer, among other places? We've just created a whole new class of those people because they can't get upgrades anymore. That's what that consequence is. Yeah,
and actually a lot of the what we're told are the benefits, or at least the stimulation for these laws, like the executive order, that was for a national security emergency, right? And, you know, here in the United Kingdom and in other countries, the national security emergency, the real-life terror attacks, make us look at encryption as a threat rather than a protection. So is more encryption always better from your point of view?
I think you've drawn a link that is really important, and I want to double down on this. So the regulation, or the regulatory response, let's call it that, of that executive order, was an attempt to say, here's a national security problem, I'm going to clamp down on this thing, and what we've created is a new class of vulnerability that was an unintended consequence of that. A similar kind of thing happens in the discussion around encryption, where people say, this encryption thing is preventing us from seeing these messages, and we would be able to stop the guy who's going to drive with the van onto whatever sidewalk you can pick anywhere in the world. I live in Toronto. We had a guy with a van on a sidewalk. Here we are in London, had a guy with a van on a sidewalk, etc. And it always involves, and we see this every time, that there is this threat from these encrypted messages, and so law enforcement says we have a legitimate interest in getting hold of that. And I understand all of that. I am not in favor of terrorism, just for the record. I don't believe that terrorism is good. But we need to understand that the consequence of weakening that kind of encryption also means that everyone's banking is at risk. That every single financial transaction that ever happens in the world is at risk if you undermine that. This is not a choice between privacy and security. It's a choice between one kind of security and another kind of security. And I have to say that if I have to weigh the danger of guy with a van versus the danger of terrorists empty all the bank accounts in the City of London tomorrow, I know which one of those is a bigger deal. And it seems to me that there's going to be a lot of panic if you empty everybody's bank account tomorrow, and that's not an implausible scenario if you have keys that leak.
But it isn't, it wouldn't be everybody's, that they wouldn't weigh that, everybody wouldn't weigh that equation in the same way. Other people might disagree. They would view the sanctity of human life as probably greater, more important than the sanctity of the banking system or the sanctity of the network.
So if I change the sanctity of the banking system for the sanctity of the first responder network, does it change your... every single thing depends on reliable encryption now. Everything we do, all of the communications that we make depend on that. That's how it works. This is a fundamental building block in order to make the systems work together. And when somebody comes... this is actually true of network shutdowns more generally. That when people start shutting down networks, it always seems to me the main thing they're doing is harming themselves. They're harming their own interests because they're undermining the ability of the most reliable and yet cheap mechanism for communication that we've ever invented. They want to undermine that in favor of some notion of security. Now, I understand those notions of security.
So let's take the argument that is posed in response to this, which is like, we get it. We're good at maths actually, and we understand that the laws of mathematics are not going to be, overridden by the laws of the land. However, we're good, and we are, we represent a democracy in which human rights are respected. So why can't we have access to? So can we have a bit of the, just make it a bit easier for us, because these are not made-up threats. These are actually loss of life. This is terrifying. Everybody in this room will recall those events. This isn't just a sort of a hypothetical. So why not just weaken encryption or present some way in for our people so that they can protect us better?
So how do I know that your people are your people?
Well, we all know each other. We all know. Let's imagine that that bit's okay, and you do know.
So just so I can fully unpack this scenario, let's imagine that I've got a software system that is perfectly implemented and has no bugs anywhere.
That sounds plausible to me. Anybody? Yeah.
And that the 30,000 odd people who are involved in this social function, every one of them has had perfect key operations for their entire lifetime.
Okay.
Well, no, this is actually an important thing. So if I am securing a message between you and me, and I have my keys and you have your keys, and we do this key exchange, and then we're exchanging messages, there are exactly two people who are responsible for looking after the security of that communication. It's you and me. If it's you and me and the entire law enforcement infrastructure, then what that means is that all of law enforcement has to do this perfectly too. And under some circumstances, some of the proposals, for instance, I don't even know that they have access to that. So if even one of them manages to lose control of that bit of information, all of our communications are subject to subversion. And that's not just because I want to send, cat pictures back and forth to you, because maybe you're my bank, maybe you're my doctor, maybe you're my, telephone provider, and I'm trying to call the emergency services. All of these are potential threats. And they're threats that are legitimate threats on the part of somebody who wants to attack the infrastructure. Because it's not like people who want to attack the infrastructure haven't thought of this. That's what the vulnerability is. That's what we were trying to protect in the first place. So we need to be aware of the fact that the people who are the most devoted attackers of this are absolutely going to focus on that threat. That's the place that they're going to look for vulnerabilities. And it's just implausible that, people like large bureaucratic organizations, which are large and bureaucratic for perfectly good reasons. Checks and balances are a good thing in the police service. I don't think that we should take that away. But what it means is that the kind of operation that can do this perfectly is not one that involves 30 or 40,000 people at one time. They can't all have access to that. And the alternative is, well, only one of them will have access to it. Well, if only one of them has access to it, then that's the best target you've ever heard of, right? That's the person you want to subvert. So then you need checks and balances on that. So you can see how this starts to become a problem, right? Somebody's going to have, you can't, at some point you got to stop the turtles all the way down.
And I'm just going to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. So think about your questions, please. What do you do instead? So if you say, okay, that sounds a bit tricky, we've still got this problem, haven't we? Because the constant refrain from law enforcement and from the intelligence services is that this area is going dark for them, and that essential investigations are stopping short, that people who are viewed as at risk are able to communicate, and they're blindsided. So what do they do instead? Have you got a message of hope for them?
Well, so one thing that I will say is that this goes back to what we started with earlier with the automobile. The automobile was a transformative technology, and it was a transformative technology in all kinds of unusual ways. One of the most interesting ones is the invention of jaywalking. So in 1910, if you sent your children outside to play, they played in the streets. That was a normal thing to do. Send your kids out to play in the streets. Now, if you tell somebody, go send your kids to play in the streets, that's an insult, right? Like, that's a threat. And the difference was we invented automobiles and we brought them into cities. And there were lots and lots of efforts to prevent automobiles from coming into cities, or like you had to walk in front with a flag. That was, right, everybody's read about this with the man with the flag in front, or trying to keep automobiles at a certain speed and so on. But fundamentally, the technology altered the world that we're in. And so what's happened here in many ways is that we're going to have to revert to certain kinds of things. We are approaching this as though the internet is basically just like a big telephone system, and we had wiretaps in telephones, and so
was great, right?
And it was great, and so now we need wiretaps on the internet. And the problem is the internet is not a telephone system, and so using that analogy breaks down because the similarity breaks down. What you need are new policing techniques, some of which are old-fashioned policing techniques, right? Some of those are old-fashioned kinds of things, and quite frankly, some of the reason that people want these things is because they're under financial pressure. There's financial pressure, and I get it, there's financial pressure on every public service in order to do more with less, right? We hear that every single time. But the fundamental problem is if you want to stop certain kinds of terror acts and you want to do it with policing, you're going to have to do that partially by funding the police well enough. Another piece of this, of course, is that we have to develop social controls that actually prevent this kind of activity in the first place. And that's the other piece of this, right? It isn't okay that people think, like, our problem is not that we always had people who wanted to film racist massacres and broadcast them to the world, and only now do we have the internet to help us do it. The problem is we have people who want to film racist massacres. That's what the problem is in the first place, and we actually need to address that problem in order to address many of these things, and that provides a world in which we can all live. And I think that that is one of the critical pieces about this, the idea that we can do this by stamping out things that we don't like. Human history doesn't tell us that stamping out things we don't like is always that successful.
Thank you. Questions? Anybody in the audience like to ask a question? Gentleman at the back.
Very interesting. You mentioned at the very beginning about insurance driving the need for regulation. But what kind of insurer and who is the victim of the failure if we have the internet breaking democracy?
So the cases of breaking democracy are a really interesting problem. There are a couple of different problems here, and I think that we need to tease them apart. One is the sort of straightforward attack on systems. That is the attack on voting, subversions of registration lists and so on. And we've definitely seen examples of that. We don't have clear and positive evidence that there's ever been a successful case, but we've definitely got accounts at least of people trying to do it. So that's one kind of problem. And this is a straightforward information security problem. So it's really just like the same kind of thing as every other insurable thing where you've got a valuable thing and you want to protect it from the world, whether that be banking or personal information of other kinds and so on. Those are pretty much standard kinds of things. And in that case, it's the registrar of voters who's the wounded party and presumably the electors whose stuff has been damaged. That's a little different from the social manipulation kind of stuff that happens through social media, where the advertising mechanism is being used in order to amplify certain kinds of messages fairly effectively in an effort to bias elections or to change the outcomes of elections a little bit differently by influencing voters. And that kind of problem actually has to do with the advertising and social media environment in which we're talking about. And that's not purely an internet thing. It's typically almost entirely up here in particular content envelopes. One of the things that I find interesting there is that the message there is in favor of a particular kind of outcome. And for some reason, we seem to be trying to stamp out the message that we don't want rather than trying to drown out the message that we don't want. This is, after all, an advertising platform. And if somebody can use that advertising platform to change the direction this way, why can't we use the advertising platform to change the direction the other way? And it seems to me that one of the things that we haven't been engaging with here is an effort to kind of shape those things. Maybe that's because it's not that clear that we really want the government involving itself in trying to shape the message around elections. So I recognize that this is an open topic where we really need to have a discussion about it. But it's quite different from the first discussion, which is just an attack on the voting infrastructure itself. I want to separate those kinds of things. I do think that there's an urgent problem around message shaping in the society more generally, and how social media can do that. But I think that is actually quite a bit smaller topic than the internet, writ large. It really has to do with how certain kinds of advertising platforms amplify certain kinds of messages. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what can we do in order to change those kinds of messages that come through?
Thank you. I've got a sort of spray of questions along here. Shall I start with you, Patricia, and then we can, could we just take the three questions in turn? Yeah.
Sure. So thanks very much, Andrew. I thought it was fascinating. And I was really taken with your transformative technology approach and the comparison to the car. I would also introduce the aeroplane and the issue of the way safety regulations have changed things as things got faster and more dangerous. And now we have fewer fatalities from air crashes than any other time in history, notwithstanding some really awful ones recently, but if you spread it out over a few years. And I think that, part of what we've done, particularly when you look at cars, when you look at airplanes, it's about managing complexity. And, there's no more complex system that, in terms of, the number of things that can go wrong that we manage than really in air traffic control and so on. They're all done by machines now, right? Thank God. So my question is this. I think we find it hard with our very complex human brains to understand complexity and to understand how connectivity creates complexity. And so at the United Nations, in various parts of the world, through various multi-stakeholder processes, etc., everybody's trying to grapple with how we manage this thing, and people are looking at the issue of norms. Is this really the right approach that we should be going down? We're going to be talking about this over the next few days in the Cyber 2019 conference here. There's a huge effort at the moment trying to essentially grab the soul of the internet. Is there a transformative way we could do this rather than the old, more pedestrian ways? Is what I'm asking.
Okay, hold the thought.
I had Lucy and Taylor, Oxford Information Labs. Mine really follows on what Patricia's saying, I suppose, but going back to the regulations and the regulators. I've just been watching a fascinating debate in The Hague, moderated by Emily, this morning, really dealing with the same thing. I feel like the world is being bought by three guys at the moment. We've just seen Bitcoin, Facebook, or whatever it's going to be called. This is becoming terrifying. We really need to feel like we've got a handle on this. And in the same debate, and I'm not going to mention names, we had representatives of the regulators who were saying, well, we could look at education. And there just seems to be such a gulf between the people who really need to do something right now, because it's getting really scary. Is there a way as an industry that we can help the regulators without just screaming at them? The things that come out, the cookie notices, I just scream at my telly, scream at my computer. We need to find a better way of working more effectively with Boris and Rory and people. Sorry, Rory, not Rory anymore, but Boris and people.
Thank you. Okay, great. I'm going to please go ahead, and then I'm going to come back to Andrew and then come to you. Thank you.
I really support two previous questions, actually, and want to ask more concrete questions. There are a lot of internet regulations already exist in this world. So Russia, China, well, even here in Britain, there are some internet regulations. But you, as CEO of ISOC and chair of Internet Architecture Board, are there any valuations of such regulations? Do ISOC and IETF as informal organizations have opinions on current regulatory documents all over the world about breaking technology, breaking social things? Or maybe you are planning to do such things?
Okay, so we've got safety regulations and managing complexity. Are norms the right approach? We seem to have three companies that are just scaring people. And actually, in this debate this morning in The Hague, I mean, Eurodig is pretty much the most multi-stakeholder environment you could possibly imagine. And yet the audience said that they were most afraid of corporate power being unchecked, much more so than, say, stifling innovation or all of the stuff that you would expect. And then internet regulations, is it really a question about, do you as the Internet Society propose any model regulations, or are there examples that you think of as a good regulation? Is that the...
Making assessment of how that regulations actually...
I see. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think that one of the things that is true, it's good to draw analogies with past things because they inform us, right? It's not for nothing that we have jurisprudence, right? If we had to come upon every single thing as de novo, we would have a whole lot harder time of it. So I think that that's useful, but it's also important to recognize that new transformative technologies do in fact present new challenges, right? We did learn something from the automotive industry when we started doing safety regulations for airplanes, but we didn't do exactly the same thing. Because they're, a different kind of thing. To begin with, they're, in a third dimension, and that creates two kinds of problems. So I think that, but there's another kernel in what you were saying, which is a lot of this stuff is done by machine. And I think that there's a critical part of that we need to understand that in order to design a system that is adequately regulable, we need the norms in the sense of we need those norms in order to tell us what principles we're going to bring to this kind of thing, rather than responding to each individual threat. Just to pick up on something you were mentioning about this fear that we hear of too great corporate concentration, what that really amounts to is that's the threat right now, right? We're wired almost to see immediate threats, and so that's the one that we're responding to. What we need are norms in order to tell us, this is how we respond to threats in general. But then there is this question of, okay, well, this is a new kind of threat. How are we going to respond to that? And some of that is going to involve machinery. Some of that is going to involve applying the correct principles. And some of that is going to involve very difficult compromises among different choices. And what that ultimately means is that when you say to the regulators, look, you need to do something about this, the problem for the regulator, I think in a lot of cases, is you need to do something, this is something, therefore you must do this. And that, of course, is a bad syllogism. And so what we need, in fact, are proposals about how these kinds of things can work. Which brings us nicely to this third question about, okay, well, what are good and bad sorts of things? And I'm going to answer that question in a way that I know is going to dissatisfy you. I am not a country.
Not on purpose, right?
Well, maybe. I am not a country, and I'm not a government. I'm not in a position to tell governments who are sovereign authorities what good and bad is in their political realm, because there are lots of different countries and they have lots of different views. What I can say is, here is how this network infrastructure works. And the network infrastructure depends on certain kinds of loose couplings among the different parts of it. And so what you need is a regulation that is fit for purpose. It needs to be correctly targeted at the thing you're trying to regulate. And what we keep seeing instead are regulations, to pick on China because they're always the one that everybody picks on. But what they've effectively done is they've said, okay, everybody inside this thing, they get to connect with one another because it's a tightly regulated environment. And then you've got this gateway to the rest of the world. And that gateway to the rest of the world allows you some access to those other resources. That is not what I think of as the internet. And the reason I don't think of it as the internet is because it isn't really a network of networks. It's a system that allows access to this outside thing. The plan that Russia has, keeps announcing, how they're going to turn themselves off from the rest of the internet and protect themselves locally, is an attempt to actually make their network less good for local purposes.
And did they manage to do that? I couldn't find any...
I haven't found any evidence.
No, yeah.
The interesting thing is that this isn't the first time that they announced that they were going to do this, and the last time it definitely failed. So one of the things that's interesting about that, though, is that if they are successful, they will actually have made the network worse. That's not the right direction for your own interests. Right? I'm not here to tell you what the right outcome is for Russia or for China or for Ethiopia, who did a big shutdown recently. I'm not here to tell people that. Instead, what I'm here to say is, look, here's this technology that puts you in control, but it has these effects. It has these effects, but it allows you to build things under your own local control with your own local abilities, because it's a network of networks. That's a magically transformative technology. It provides a lot of benefit. I mean, we talk about all these threats right now because they're scary, but there is an awful lot of baby in the bathwater. There is really a lot of benefit from the internet. We get things today that you just couldn't have dreamt of when I was growing up. And those connections are valuable. My ability to talk to my parents from here, in the 1970s when I was growing up, if I wanted to call my parents who were back in Canada from here, this was like about 1 million years of pumping coins into the box, right? And now I do it by video conference, which was a magical technology at the time, and I can do it for nothing. And that's not that meaningful right now because I'm just traveling here for a few days. But for the large diaspora populations in the world who want to keep connections with people back at home, this is the way people can do it, and they just couldn't have in the past. And that's a simple example. So we must remember that these benefits are there, and we need to offer them to people who are apparently willing to turn them off. They want to turn them off, I can't help.
So I've got a lady at the back. Okay, right. Right.
I can talk shorter.
Yeah, let's just try and get as many comments from the audience as we can. I'm going to go lady at the back, then to you, Nigel, and down here. So let's see where we are there. We've got 10-ish minutes left, and let's just see obviously something you've said has hit a nerve.
Hi there. So I'm coming from a slightly different background than digital humanities and working with very large public events. So I would suggest that technology actually only changes conditions of possibility rather than the actual material that we're talking about in transgression, which is human agency. That's not really changed that much for a very long time. So technology reflects a kind of modern imagining of who we think we are or we might be. You talk about transformative technologies. You talk about wheels, but what happens when you remove the wheels and you look at the person behind the steering? So working with live audience tells a very different story about what humans are and how they respond to conditions of possibility. And what I sort of fear, particularly in the context of concentration of power and very few corporate entities, is if there is a space to address who we are rather than who we think we are in relation to the possibilities opened by network technology, whilst keeping the vision of democracy alive.
Thank you. Lady there, second row back.
Hi, I just had a question. So assuming that you're right that a big insurance risk will change the way regulation of cyber works, absolutely we should be dealing with the root causes for security risks. How would you apply that to online harm? So things like online child sexual exploitation and abuse, particularly in the context that even if we were to dealing with the underlying issue there is incredibly challenging, but also by putting those images online, it becomes more acceptable so that we have these issues where there are plenty of people who wouldn't dream of doing that in real life, but will do it on the internet, and that can lead to a regression to real life.
Thank you. Nigel at the back, and then this chap at the front. And
Yes, thank you very much. Andrew, you've covered quite a bit of ground, and some of the questions just now take you further in this width of the internet and whatever. How does the internet society how do you see positioning itself with this vast array of internet issues that we now face, from the technical, to the human rights, to the social, to the law enforcement, to the human rights on the internet, child protection? I mean, how do we as organisations, and I work for ICANN and we face similar problems, but I mean, you have a wider remit. I mean, how do we cope with these ever-increasing issues? Thank you.
Thank you. And if you can just get the microphone down the front there, and then also, sorry, the lady, lady at the front there, and then I'd like to just come back to you quickly, and if I've got time, I'm going to come over to this side of the audience. Please go ahead.
Okay. You've touched on a couple of things that seem to be in conflict to me. And so we've been talking about how there's this huge push for regulation from lawmakers and the strong bipartisan support for swift action, right, against some of the internet giants. And you're also talking about how we should be really nervous about that kind of regulation being introduced quickly and it leading to essentially balkanization of the internet, which is kind of what you referred to before. They seem in complete conflict. We kind of want to do something quickly. We're really nervous about how doing something quickly might break the internet, which is something we haven't really spoken about. How do we reconcile that quickly?
Thank you. And just very quickly, this lady down the front, if I may.
Thank you. One thought that's come to mind is that all the talk about regulation, what the internet, the benefits, the pros and the cons, but we've not really talked about society and what society is expecting. Because what you see with GDPR is that, true enough, there are all the cookies and you have to agree, but how many people have actually taken the time to actually read through that? You're looking for access, you're looking to quickly, so my thing is there seems to be a big disconnect between what the negative things are that we see on the internet and then also what society is really willing to accept for the convenience, because the ICO has already said that the average, person they've interviewed, their definition of informed consent is quite different. And do people really understand informed consent? So society seems to be on sort of at a schizophrenic type situation there. That's my opinion. I don't know.
Thank you. There was an awful lot of content in those questions. So, from what it means really to be a person, and the sort of what it means, the questions about child sexual exploitation and the sort of normalisation of these name your topic really, something very organisational about ISOC's mission and positioning. And a bit more, please, about breaking the internet, and also about the sort of what we just seem to be asleep, don't we? And we seem to be just tolerating all of this because it's more convenient and a bit more fun.
Well, there's a nice thread in all of these questions that I'm going to pick up on, and this will probably not quite answer all of them, but I'll try. One of my favorite aphorisms is by John Culkin or maybe Winston Churchill, and that is, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And what this tells me is something about how societies work. One of the critical things that we see about, for instance, many of the issues that people are concerned about online is that they're already illegal. They're already against the law, and they're already awful. I mean, nobody thinks that abusing children is okay. If you go and ask anybody, including people who actually have abused children, is it okay to abuse children? The answer is always no. And I think that what that tells us is that we have, in fact, before us, a technology that we need to pick up on something that the first person said. We need to pay a lot of attention to what it is to be a human in relation to this technology, and we need actually to think pretty carefully about tech fixes for what are actually fairly deep social problems. So there are things we can do with the technology that have to do with, trying to, for instance, find this content and suppress it and so on online. And we have mechanisms, for instance, which involve signatures over images and signatures over video files and so on. And we know how to find those, and we need to distribute those signatures perhaps more widely and make those kinds of things more. But those are all like sort of technical, detailed fixes. The real question is, what do you do about the normalization of this? And what I think is, what we do about that is we be a society. And so this comes back to Nigel's question about, well, what's the Internet Society's role here? Well, we're the place where the internet and the society come together, but the internet needs to be part of that. And I think most critically, there's a lot of stuff right now where people are talking about things as though they're internet problems, and they're not. What they are problems that are already illegal, and all that's happened is we've hooked it up to the internet, and then people say, oh, it's an internet problem. That's not an internet problem. That's a problem we already dealt with. Very large, giant corporations. We already know actually what to do about very large, giant corporations. We have mechanisms for that. There may be specific things that we do in relation to the way that the internet interacts with that. That's the specific kind of thing. And so to bring this down to this question of, okay, but what are the details of how you do this? How do you act quickly and also not act too quickly so that you break it all? Well, that's the piece of proportionality. You need to make sure that you're actually targeting this kind of effort at the specific thing you're trying to deal with, rather than sneaking through a new piece of legislation in order to change the political discourse because, oh, it's the internet now, and so everything's different. A lot of the proposals that we see are actually attempts to relitigate existing social compromises that people have come up with, because now it's the internet, and so we need new rules. And I think that what we need to do is say, well, okay, that discussion over there is one that you can continue to have. I mean, societies evolve. There's nothing wrong with that. But this particular thing is not an internet issue. This particular thing has to do with this social issue. This other thing over here, this is a particular internet thing, and now we have a tightly constrained particular technical problem that we're attempting to address. And I think that that's the effort that we need to involve people. Some of this involves a lot of education of regulators who are talking. I mean, this is precisely why we're talking about this, right? How do you regulate the internet? The answer to that is, well, you can't. What you want to ask actually is, how do you regulate this? How do you regulate that? How do you regulate this other thing? And those are the detailed kinds of things that we need to have this conversation. That's the level where we need to have it.
And the last point, that was pretty heroic, dealing with a lot of very disparate questions and getting a narrative theme. But can we just come back to the sort of, we seem to care about the companies, but we don't seem to care really, because we just click and then carry on watching the cat video. So
this is a really interesting point. The Internet Society worked with Consumers International recently on Internet of Things devices. We did a survey. We're not competent at talking to consumers, and so we collaborated with them because they know how to talk to consumers and we know about the internet. And this is a great kind of collaboration, just as we have this great collaboration with Chatham House. What we were trying to do in that case is to understand what people wanted to do and so on. And a vast number of people, like the majority of people in basically every market, said that they found Internet of Things devices creepy. creepy. You know, I mean, so, and there was an operationalization of that, but people seem to know what creepy meant. The thing that I found fascinating was the majority in every market, a majority of people said, but I'm going to buy one anyway. And then they went on to say, and somebody should do something about this. And I'll tell you what, if like it seems to me that if your car got a reputation as like randomly crashing into things every time you got into it under normal conditions, probably you'd stop buying it. But for some reason, it's the internet, and people are finding the desire here. And what I hear are two really interesting things there. One is that people feel that there's something that is really convenient about this. There's something really valuable in this sort of stuff. And so with the narrative that, oh, we need to shut this internet thing down because it's too dangerous, that's obviously not true. People want it. The other thing is that it seems to me there's a massive market opportunity for somebody who can come along and make that security useful to ordinary humans. I understand something about how the internet works. I've worked on it for a long time, and I am mystified by a lot of the security technology. I mean, you know, I go to work on it, and I start fooling with it and everything like that, and I eventually go back to resetting from everything and trying it 3 or 4 times, and eventually I get it good enough. I'm a genuine expert in this thing, and I can't make it work. There is no hope for my mother. And that is a market opportunity if ever there was one. We made internal combustion engines, which are vastly complicated things, less polluting and reliable enough that you can buy a car and never change its spark plugs. How many of you have a theory about what spark plugs you have in your car? Yeah, see? This was a thing that in the 1920s you absolutely knew. You needed to know about that in order to be a driver, because you had to be able to fix it. That's a massive change to this technology that was really because there was a consumer demand to make this thing reliable enough and useful enough that you never had to think about it. And that's the world that we need to build.
And on that note, a couple of minutes late, but thank you for addressing that question. And also thank you for such a rich tour around so many topics, Andrew, and for joining us here in Chatham House, where we're always delighted to work with the Internet Society. So I'd like to thank all of you, and apologies for the questions I didn't get to.